All right. So what we have on the agenda for tonight is that we want to we're going to be creating a letterhead and then a business letter in Microsoft Word. So to do this, we're going to be in Chapter 3 of Microsoft Word. So if you haven't yet picked up the Chapter 3 handout, make sure you pick up the Chapter 3. And on page 139, we have what our little letter is going to end up looking like. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to open up Microsoft Word, and we want to create a new blank document in Microsoft Word. So we want to click on and create a blank document in Word. And on the bottom of page 141, they talk about what are the important things in creating a letterhead. And so you want to make sure that you read through the stuff that they have on the bottom of page 141. But what we need to do first is we need to change our margins. So to change our margins, you change margins. There are several places you can change margins in Microsoft Word. The simplest place to do it is in page layout. And when you're in page layout, there is on the left-hand side, it has the page setup, and inside of page setup, it has margins. And the margin choices they want us to do are moderate, which is to say 1 inch off the top, 1 inch off the bottom, and 0.75 inches off the left and right. So we want to change our margins to the moderate choices. Now, another place where you could do that is if you are in your print settings. So if you do a file print and then you click on to page setup, that is another place where you can bring up the page setup. Another way to get to the page setup is if you are in page layout and you click on a page setup, that'll also bring up the page setup. And then in margins, you can change the margins manually right here to say 0.75 and 0.75 and 1 and 1. Like I said, there are lots of different places where you can change your margins. Any questions? All right. So what we are wanting to do is we are wanting to insert, what we're doing, the first thing that we are doing is we are going to be creating kind of a box. And that box is going to be where we're going to put in the words Alexander Lee Samaras. So in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to insert a shape. Now, if you are on insert and you go to when you're on insert, you want to then go to shapes. And when you go to shapes, the shape that we want to do is we want to insert a rectangle shape. So you just want to do insert shapes and then rectangle. And again, this is on page 142. And what you want to do is you want to click and drag a shape to be approximately the page. It doesn't really matter exactly how you do it, because once you have basically got it done, what you want to do is over in the shape tool, you want to make it precise. And the precise shape that we want it to be is 0.53 inches tall. So 0.53 inches tall. and the width is 5.7. So we want the width to be 5.7. And the height to be 0.53. So again, this is on page 143. So 0.53 inches tall and 5.7 inches wide. Again, page 143. .7. Step 5, page 143. So if you don't have your book out on page 143, have your book out on page 143. And then step number 5 is where we want to be. Okay. Questions? No? No questions, or no, you don't have it? Okay, okay. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to change this. You'll notice that there's this little anchor symbol on the left-hand side. The reason that there's this little anchor symbol on the left-hand side is that Word is telling us that it's anchored at that spot, and we could actually click and drag it around and move it wherever we wanted to move it, but we don't want to actually do that. What we want to do is we want to change this from being a floating object to being an inline object. And that's because we want this box to actually be precisely located exactly where we want it to be. That is at that spot. And you'll notice on page 144 that there is a little table indicating the differences between what a floating box does versus what a floating object versus an inline object. And that inline objects are those objects that are part of the text itself. So it treats an inline object as if it were a character that you are typing. And whereas a floating object is outside of the characters. Outside of the characters, there is square and tight and through and top and bottom and behind text and in front of text. So what we want to do is we want to change our object's position. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to select our object and make sure that the drawing tools are on here. And we want to click onto position. And on position, we want this to actually be positioned in top center with square text wrapping. So we want the middle one to be the choice. And then what we want to do is that we want to select this text from being the square to being top and bottom. And the reason we want this to be top and bottom as opposed to square is so that the box itself, this box, will be the stuff that goes above it and the stuff that will go below it, and there won't be any content on either side. So let me show you what this looks like with something other than a square box. So if you're typing something else, I just want you to stop for a moment and look up. And I'm just going to insert a picture. I will randomly pick this guy, and we'll put some text around him. So we'll say some fake lorem ipsum text. And so we've got some text, and I'm going to put this picture like right here. So if I select this picture and I click onto him, right now he's in line with the text, which means that as I type, he moves along. And as I remove stuff, he moves along. But if I take him and make him not be in line with the text, and instead I make him squared, then what it does is it squares up the content. And if I choose tight, I don't know if you saw the difference, but over here, if I go back and forth, it moves just slightly. So tight is slightly more tightly moved in. If I do through, it's again slightly more. If I do top and bottom, then it goes so that the content to the left and right is empty, and the text above and the text below the picture. So this is what top and bottom does. That's why we want this to be what we're using for our letterhead, because we want our letterhead picture to have top and bottom. But the other choice that you can do would be in front of text. So in front of text means that the picture is in front of the text. And obviously behind the text means that the picture is behind the text. So those are all of the wrapping choices. And in the case of this, we're talking about a rectangle, but it could be any object. So all objects are treated the same in Microsoft Word. So it's it acts the same way, whether it's a picture or whether it's a rectangle or whether it's a star or any other type of picture. All right, so like I said, we want it to be the top and bottom method. And the reason we want it to be the top and bottom method is so that our flashing cursor shows up then below the picture, which is what we want. I'm sorry? Oh. Oh, yeah. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to change what the picture looks like. So right now it's this style of picture. And what they want us to do is they want us to go into the styles and they want us to pick the subtle style, the subtle effect. And then they want us to add text to the object. And what's cool about this is that if you go to the picture and you right click on the picture, there is a choice that will say add text. So if we add text to the picture, I'm sorry? So if you right click onto it, it should allow you to add text. So if you select the picture, select the rectangle, right click, and go down to where it says add text. And the text that we want to add is going to be Alexander Lee Samaras. And this is on page 146. And then they want us to increase the font size up to size 24. So you can do that either by clicking on increase font size until it gets to size 24, or you could click onto the drop-down menu and make it go to 24, or you type in 24. Lots of different ways to make it become 24. And they also want it to be bold. So that's the stuff that's on page 147. So at the end, you should look like this. On page 148, the next thing that we want to do on this is we want to change our theme to the organic theme. So to change our theme to the organic theme, we want to click on a design, and then we want to click on themes, and then the theme that they want us to use is the organic theme. And as I said in my assignment, which is Word Chapter 3, Part 1, if somehow your computer does not have the organic theme, I've included a link to it on the assignment. Questions? Page 148 at the bottom. What we want to do next is we want to insert the books picture. Now the problem is that Microsoft no longer has the ability to, when you do insert online pictures, to do clip art. Clip art does not exist on here. So there's a couple of things that I want to tell you about pictures. The first thing I want to tell you about pictures is that when you are inserting somebody else's picture, you are inserting somebody else's picture. And the problem with inserting somebody else's picture is that unless that person has explicitly given you permission to use that picture, it is actually illegal for you to use that other person's picture. So if I fire up Google and I go and I do a Google search for, say, I don't know, San Jose, and I click onto images, there are a bajillion pictures on here. The problem is almost none of them are legal for me to use. And the way that you know that it's okay for you to use that other person's picture is that if you click onto tools and you click onto usage rights, by default, it says not filtered by license. But if you instead choose labeled for reuse with modification, then the pictures that are present are okay for you to use. But unless you do that, the pictures you find in Google are not okay for you to use. Now, if you're doing it for schoolwork or for other nonprofit work, then you can go down to the bottom where it says labeled for non-commercial reuse with modification. And then there might be some more pictures that might pop up that would be okay for you to use. But the problem with just doing a Google search and looking for a picture is that almost certainly the pictures that you find are going to be illegal for you to use. And the only way that it's legal for you to use them is if the person has explicitly marked them as legal for you to use. And the reason for that is that in the mid-90s, actually it's really the late 90s, Congress passed a law called the Digital Copyright Millennium Act, or was it the Digital Millennium Copyright Act? Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, or was it DCMA? DCMA, Digital Copyright Millennium Act. And what that really did was it was primarily done so that it became illegal for us to swap music and movie files. Because in the early 90s, what we would do is we would all rip a bunch of CDs and then share them with everybody using a program called Napster. And that was illegal, but we did it anyways. and they struck it down and said, no, you can't do that. And one of the ways that they made that the case was they made it so that anything that is digitally published has the same force of law as things that were traditionally published. So in the olden days, prior to 1999, that if you publish something online, you might or might not have the rights to it. But what happens now is that if you publish something online, you have the exact same rights as somebody who publishes something traditionally. So you have the exact same rights to your content that, I don't know, the New York Times does when they publish their work, or that Knopf does when they publish their books, or Scholastic does when they publish their books. So when you go to, say, if I take my daughter to Great America and I snap a photo of her on Gold Striker and I put it on, I tweet about it and I post it to Twitter. Well, by doing that, I have digitally published that picture. And I have the exact same rights to that picture that any other copyright owner has on their pictures. So unless I explicitly say everybody can use this picture, nobody can use that picture. Now, what I often get is that I often hear from people, they say, yeah, but I've been using, going onto Google and taking people's pictures and putting it onto my PowerPoint presentations for years. And I've never once gotten in trouble. To which I say this, okay, if you are driving down the freeway and you are going 120 miles an hour on the freeway and no police officer catches you, did you still break the law? But no police officer caught you. Doesn't matter. It was still an illegal and immoral thing for you to go 120 miles an hour. Just because nobody has caught you doesn't mean that it's legal. It just means that nobody has caught you and you haven't been sued yet, but it is possible that somebody might sue you. So it's always best to use, labeled for non-commercial reuse with modification. Now, the good news is that in both Word and PowerPoint is that if you use the Bing image search in here, by default, Bing will use the labeled for reuse. So if on here I do a search for, say, books, and it searches for books, by default, it will do Creative Commons only. If I say all, well, then it might not, in which case then it would not be something that would be legal. So we're going to go ahead and use, like, I don't know, you can use any of the ones that you find that look okay-ish enough, kind of like the one that they have in the on page 149. This one looks close enough, so I'm going to go ahead and use this one. Now, the problem with this is that's way, 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 way too big. So I need to change the size of this, and I need to change the size of this picture so that it will become, in my picture tools right now, this is 6 inches by 7 inches, and this needs to be a height of 0.53 inches. Because I want it to live up here in this area. And this guy is 0.53 inches tall. So because this needs to be 0.53 inches tall, this needs to be 0.53 inches tall. Now, the book is saying to scale it to 14, but you don't want to scale it to 14. You want to scale it to 0.53 inches tall, whatever 0.53 inches tall. That might be 14%, but it might not be. All right, so the first thing that we want to do with this is that now that we have this picture here is that we want it to match the color of the Alexander Lee Samaras stuff. Well, this is color green, so we want to make this become color green. So to make this become color green, in our picture tools, in color, we can change the color in recolor to be green. Green accent color 1 dark, which is this guy right here. So now we have a green set of books. I'm sorry?
Could you please say it again?
So again, I select the picture, and in color, I chose green. Page 151. The next thing that we want to do, and this is really, 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 really cool. It's one of the coolest features in both PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. And that is that in color, there is a choice called Set Transparent Color. And what the Set Transparent Color does is it allows you to pick any color in a picture and make it be transparent. So make it be the color transparent so that it is, disappears when it's behind something else. So if we click transparent color and then we pick the green, it becomes clear. If I do that with, say, my picture, I could go in my picture, and I could go on my picture, I could go in picture tools and color, and I could say set transparent color, and I could make this color pink on my forehead to be transparent, in which case I'm all splotchy. Or I could make my hair transparent, in which case all of the browns would become transparent. The point is that you can choose to make a color transparent by choosing Set Transparent Color. So again, this is on page 152 in your book. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to adjust the brightness and contrast. So to adjust the brightness and contrast, this is in corrections. And in corrections, they're wanting us to go from this to this to make it a little bit brighter. They're saying 20%. Corrections, and then plus 20%. It's on page 153. The next thing that we want to do is on page 154, and that is that right at the moment there's no border around this, and they want us to put a border around it. So to put a border around it, we go to picture border, and we pick a color. So they want it to be green, so we'll pick green. And now there is a picture border around the books. So again, to get to that was in Picture Tools, and in Picture Tools, Picture Border. And then picture border, we're picking green. And then the next thing that we're going to do on this is that we're going to move it. And we want to move it to be on the left or the right of the box. So to move it, we need to, again, change it so that it's not in line with text. And instead of it being in line with text, actually, no, I think we can just keep it as in line with text. No, I don't. No, it doesn't. We do need to. We do need to change it from being in line with text to being in front of text. In front of text. And now that we have it as in front of text, we can move it so that it is, say, to the left of Alexander Lisa Morris. Now, you may notice that it's not going to be exactly precise, and that is okay because the book is actually wrong. And it said for this to be 0.53, which means that this should be 0.53. Well, the problem with that is that if it's 0.53 and you then apply a border to it, it's going to be slightly more than 0.53. It's going to be 0.53 plus a border. And unless your border is 0, it's not going to be 0.53 anymore. It's going to be 0.53 plus the size of the border. It'll be 0.54 almost. So if you want it to be precise, then you can change the size of the picture to be slightly less than 0.53. And then it should fit. So like 0.52. 0.52, I think, will probably fit. And then you can line it up exactly. But quite frankly, if you want to keep it at 0.53, that's totally fine because it is what the book told us to do, and 0.53 is fine for, for the assignment. It's totally okay for it to not match exactly perfectly. In real life, I would match it perfectly. In real life, I would probably do 0.52 and make it fit, or I would make this increased to not be 0.53 and instead make it be 0.54 or something like that. I don't know, something along those lines. Yeah. So the way to, in order to make it drag, you need to first change the wrapping so that the wrapping is set to in front of text. Once you make it in front of text, then you should be able to move it. All right. So we've got the books on the left-hand side. What about the right-hand side? Well, we want to move the books to also be on the right-hand side. So to do that, we need to copy and paste it. So to copy it, we need to select it. Once we have it selected, we can either click onto the copy button, or you can do a Control-C to copy. And then to paste, you can either do the paste and then paste, or you can do Control-V to paste. And once you've done one of those, you'll have two choices. You'll have two pictures, and you want one picture to be on the right and one picture to be on the left. And then the last thing that we want to do on this letterhead is that, so this picture of books is going this direction, right? This picture on this side is also going this direction. And visually, that doesn't look good. Visually, it looks better if one of these is pointing this way and the other is pointing this way. Now, whether you want it to be set up where where the line is going, let me do this, shape. If you want it to be lined up where it's doing a actual V, or whether you want it to be lined up where it's doing what's called an inverted V, that's up to you. The regular V method is basically you are saying, ta-da! Whereas if you do the inverted V, you are trying to cause your reader to look at the middle. In this case, the name. Both methods are valid ways of putting in pictures and causing your reader to look at your stuff. It's totally up to you which of the two you prefer to do. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have them both be the same size or the same direction. So either you want to flip this picture or you want to flip this picture. So either you want to flip this guy or you want to flip this guy. The way you flip a picture is in your picture tools. In Arrange, we have the rotate and flip. So flip vertical isn't what we want to do. We want to flip horizontal. So if I do this method, I'm doing the ta-da method, where I'm making it be an inverted V. Or I mean a regular V, making it be a regular V. If I flip the other direction, I am basically saying, look at my name. Or look at Alexander Lee Samaras' name. Either way is totally fine. But I have chosen to do the version where it is where it's flipped like this. The book is flipping it the other way. So it's up to you if you want to follow this method or the book's method. Either one is a totally valid way of doing it. So when you're done, it should look like this at this point. You want to, when you're flipping, you want to flip horizontal, because flip vertical flips it upside down. Now, what I can show you is that, you know, in like a picture of a person, this can radically change what they are doing. So on this one, if I flip me and I flip me horizontal, then it means that you're looking now at a mirror image of me. And the reason that that's important is because normally I part my hair on my left side, but this looks like I'm parting it on the right. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except it's totally the opposite of what it really is. And so it's one of those things that, you know, whatever choice you make, you want to make whichever one that is the most appropriate for your situation. Questions so far? Any problems? Okay. So you'll notice that if I turn on my show hide icon here, that my cursors down at the bottom, and I could start typing down here below the letterhead part. And that's because what we want to do is we want to put in our address. So the address is, this is on page 158. The address for Alexander Lee Samaras is at 540 Cedar Road in Branch Center, Washington, 98472. And then what they want us to do is they want us to insert a dot. So to insert a dot, the way that we do that is, first of all, we want to put in a space. And then we want to insert the dot symbol. And to do that, that's on insert, and then symbol, and then the dot, the bullet. And then we want to put in a space and then the phone number. So phone is 873-555-3928. And then we want to put in another space and another dot. And then we want to put in the email address. Email is samaras@earth.net. And all of this wants to be centered. So to make it centered, again, I could either click on a home and then click on a center, or I could do the cooler way, Control E. Make it centered. All right, the next thing that we want to do then is they want us to put a solid border underneath the Alexander Lee Samaras' address. So to do that, that's going to be in paragraph and then bottom border. The next thing that we want to do is we want to be able to start writing our letter below this. But in order to do that, we need to go on to the next line. So to go on to the next line, we need to hit enter. Now, the problem is this, that when you hit enter, it's going to put in an extra space between the picture, the address and the line. That's okay, because I'm going to show you how to get rid of it. Now, to get rid of it, what we want to do is in our home, there is a button up here that says clear all formatting. And what clear all formatting does is it gets rid of any formatting. And it removes the formatting, including the extra space above and below stuff. So if I say clear all formatting, it moves the border up so that the border is with this and not with the previous. All right. There's only a couple of other things that we need to do in part 1. And the first of the next things that we need to do is that we need to, the email address you can't read because it's green. And the reason it's green is it's because by default, Microsoft Word converts hyperlinks into hyperlinks. So text that looks like it's a hyperlink turns into a hyperlink. And the problem with that is that it becomes underlined and different colored, and we don't want that in this case. So what you want to do is you want to go anywhere in where the email address is, hover your mouse over that, and right-click. And when you right-click, there's going to be a choice that's going to say remove hyperlink. And when you do the remove hyperlink, that will convert the email address from being treated as an email address to being treated as the literal text. The last thing that we want to do is that at the end of our letterhead here, we want to set it up for writing a paper. Writing a letter, not a paper, a letter. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to change our style to no spacing, to the no spacing style. Because in a letter, business letters are, depending on the style of letter that you are writing, it usually is going to be done in single space. And on page 166, in the middle part of the page, it talks about the different styles of business letters. So the different styles of business letters are a block letter style, in which everything is flush with the left margin. That's the simplest way of making a business letter. Modified block looks best, and that's the one that we're going to do. And then modified semi-block. So what happens in a modified block style is that the date and the complimentary close, which is the part that says like sincerely or love and kisses, you know, that part is the complimentary close. And the signature block, which is where you sign, is that's positioned about a little bit off to the right of center. And the amount off of the right of center that it needs to be depends on how many letters you have in your name. Because if you have a bajillion letters in your name, then it needs to be closer to the center. And if you have hardly any, then I would put it instead. So if center is 3 in this case, or 3.5 is center, I guess, because we're at 7. So 3.5 would be center. So if you have a bajillion letters in your name, you want it to be maybe like at the 4. If you have a tiny amount of letters in your name, then maybe 5.5. And if you're like, you know, you have a ordinary number of letters in your name, then probably around 5, 5.5, somewhere around there is where it probably is going to want to be. Basically, what it wants to be is it wants to be about filling up from about here to about here. This is where you want your name to be, ish. Somewhere in this area. So to make it easier to do that, there's first of all one other important thing, and that is that the date should be two spaces from the line. So in order to make this be 2 spaces, oops, not normal, it should be no spacing. There we go, no spacing. Remember, switch it to no spacing. There should be 2 spaces there. So I've turned on my my paragraph markings so that you can see it. Without the paragraph markings, that obviously looks like this. So there should be one extra space before the part where the date goes. So the wrong way of putting the date and the complementary close and stuff would be to tab it over a whole bunch of times. The worst way would be to hit spacebar a whole bunch of times. The correct way of doing it is to set your tab spots. And to do that, this is on page 166 and 167. Now, in order to do this, you must have your ruler visible. Sometimes people hide the ruler. If you've hidden the ruler, or if somebody has hidden the ruler for you, to make the ruler reappear, it's on view, and then you tick the box that says ruler. This is what it looks like without the ruler. This is what it looks like with the ruler. So you want to make sure the ruler is present. If you see numbers on there, you have the ruler. But if you don't, to get the ruler to come back, it's on view and then ruler. And then the spot where we want to have our tab in this case is going to be at the 4-inch mark, because Alexander Lee Samaras is a normalish amount of letters, and so that's going to be a reasonable spot to put the date and the signature. So to make that happen, I want to click and position this L that appears on the 4. And the reason I want to do that is that now, if I press the tab key, it tabs all the way out to the 4. And if I were to hit return a bunch of times and then hit tab again, it would go back to that 4, to that exact spot, so that it will always be at that spot. Questions? To make this appear? Yeah. So I click anywhere in the in my tab area, and then I can drag it to where I want it to be. Another way to get there is you could right click inside of it and that would create it, and then you can double click your tab, and when you double click the tab you can specify exactly where you want the tab to be. There are different types of tabs in Microsoft Word. There's a left tab, a center tab, a right tab, a decimal tab, and a bar tab. So let me just show you quickly what those all look like. I will go into my fake text here. If I make my tab go to here and I make this be, say, make it be a left tab, which is the default, it means that when I hit tab and I start to type, it is left to right, just like normal text is. But if I change my tab, so if I double click my tab, I can change my tab from being a left tab to being a right tab. Now what that means is that it will be a right tab at that spot. I told it to go away. Put it back. If I make it a right tab, then it right aligns at that spot. If I drag it to like here, it right aligns at that spot. So this is a right tab. If it were a center tab means that it will be at the center. So it makes this be centered. The middle part of the text is the center part. Those are the three default ones. The decimal one looks for anything before a period, and then once a period happens, that's where the tab is. So it's useful for doing things like, dollars and cents. Centers it on the dollars and cents. And then a bar tab, if I make it a bar tab, it creates this little bar symbol. Wherever the tab is, there's a bar that appears at that spot. All right. Any questions about what we've done so far? Any questions? Yes.
My little pictures don't go as transparent.
Okay, so to make them transparent, again, what you want to do is you want to select go into the picture tools on your picture, and then in color, you want to choose set transparent color. And then you want to pick the thingy that you want to become transparent.
Yes, but it doesn't go like completely transparent.
Should be. All right, I'll come around and take a look. I'll take a look afterwards. All right, so at this point, we are done with part one. So if I go back to my, my part one, what we want to do is we want to save this and submit this. So in order to do that, we want to save this. So I'm going to save this on my computer in my Mark Branham Super Duper Awesome Stuff. And the title of this is going to be your name. So in my case, Branham Mark. And then this is the letterhead. So we just want to call it letterhead. And then once I've saved my letterhead, as long as I'm all done and ready for it to be published, I go in and I submit my assignment. And I am now done with part one. So it's 7:35. Why don't we take about a 10-15 minute break? When we come back from the break, what we will do is we will do part two. And part 2 is going to be to put together a business letter. So we're going to take our existing letterhead and make it into a business letter.